Hello, welcome to 251, two pianists, 5 minutes, one subject. My name's Nick Tomlin.
And I'm Simon Whiteside. Today we're asking the question, is 3 minutes long enough? And that is about the recording medium and how it affects jazz. So the history of recording can be laid out briefly into different eras. The kinetic era, or the acoustic era, from 1877 to, say, 1925. The electrical era, from 1925 to 1945. The magnetic era, from 1945 to 1975. And then finally the digital era, which is what we're in now. Very briefly, Edison invented the phonograph in 1877. The key moment then was the 78 record, which came along later, a flat disc. And that lasted 3 minutes on a 10-inch disc, running at 78 revolutions per minute. But the electrical era is called the electrical era because of electro voice and the microphone coming in, and it made it possible to record more fine detail in recordings. Early on, only really loud things could be recorded, and people had to stand nearer or further away from fundamentally the microphone, although it wasn't a microphone. Now, magnetic era talk is about tape, really. And what's interesting about that is use of magnets and iron filings meant that you could get much more accurate pictures. And you could also, on reel-to-reel tape, record for a long time. But you didn't release on that. You had to release on something else. And vinyl records running at 33 1/3 revolutions per minute, you could get about 20 minutes a side. And that's really where I won't talk about pulse code modulation and MP3s so much, because it's a very vast area. But Nick, what are your thoughts on how that relates to jazz?
Yeah, I suppose the main thing is really the length of time. I mean, jazz as a musical form, it's an improvised music. A jazz performance can last, can last potentially 5 minutes, depending on how long people want to solo for. And in the early days, as you said, you were limited to 3 minutes, maybe 3 minutes 20. Aside. And so they had to kind of find ways to cope with this by releasing albums, so sets of records, or even sometimes one performance over a number of sides. But I guess it was really the invention of the LP that, really in a way ushered in the sort of classic period for jazz, the sort of 50s and 60s really of jazz albums, when you had record labels like Blue Note really kind of made it into kind of an art form, really.
Yeah, I mean, Columbia were the kind of inventors of the LP. And in fact, RCA Victor came up with the 45 revolutions per minute 7-inch disc, which was used in the jukeboxes a great deal. But there was a thing known as the War of the Speeds, 48-49, where people, if you wanted to play, you had to have two machines, a bit like the old Betamax and VHS videotape wars of the 70s, 80s, 90s, that sort of period. But yes, the interesting thing is that the masters of jazz were on tape from quite early, but the releases of jazz were on record. Originally, you recorded directly to record. And I think that made a big difference, because there are some recordings, we've benefited from those in our Sonny Clark podcast, where those, was it the Macambo Club that he played at? Where someone had recorded tape, 20-minute long reels of tape. Yeah. And sometimes they had to fade them out because the tape was going to run out. But so we have got then some air check recordings and things like that from Charlie Parker and people, which sort of have turned up now more as collectors' curios, haven't they? But yes, I mean, Blue Note kept mono discs 78, really quite late. And I suppose then we get to the period where people like Dexter Gordon were taking up an entire side almost with one track. I think there's one Herbie Hancock album where one side is...
I mean, it gave much more room to the musicians, didn't it, to kind of... They didn't have to worry about 3 minutes, stopping after 3 minutes.
Well, we have to stop after 5 minutes. So from me, Simon Whiteside, goodbye.
And from me, Nick Tomlin, goodbye.